Long before history had names for nations, long before empires rose and fell, human beings lived in small groups, moving with the seasons, following food and water. For tens of thousands of years, this was how life worked. Then, quietly, something changed. In a flat land between two rivers, a new way of living began to form. This land was called Mesopotamia, meaning the land between rivers. The rivers were the Tigris and the Euphrates. They flooded unpredictably, sometimes gently, sometimes violently, but they carried rich silt, dark soil that made crops grow easily. This environment created both danger and opportunity. To survive here, people could not simply wander. They had to plan. They had to cooperate. They had to stay. Over time, small farming villages appeared. These villages grew larger, more permanent, more complex. And from them emerged the world's first civilization. We call these people the Sumerians. The Sumerians did not arrive suddenly. They were not conquerors. They were settlers who stayed long enough to change how humans lived forever. One of the most important questions we can ask is simple. Why here? Why did civilization begin in Sumer? The answer lies in geography. The rivers provided water, but they were unpredictable. Rainfall was scarce. If crops were to survive, water had to be managed. This forced people to work together, to dig canals, build levees, and control floods. Irrigation required planning. Planning required leadership. Leadership required organization. This chain reaction is one of the clearest explanations for how civilization began. As irrigation improved, food production increased. For the first time, there was surplus. Extra food meant not everyone needed to farm. Some people could specialize. They could become builders, potters, weavers, traders, or priests. This specialization is a defining feature of civilization. The Sumerians built the world's first cities, not towns. Cities, large, dense populations with distinct social roles. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Eridu. Uruk, at its height, may have held over 50,000 people. That was enormous for the ancient world. These cities were not random clusters of homes. They were planned. They had neighborhoods, markets, temples, and administrative centers. At the heart of each city stood a massive structure, the ziggurat. A ziggurat was a stepped temple tower, built of mud brick, rising high above the flat land. It was not a place for large gatherings. It was believed to be the dwelling place of the city's god. Each city had its own patron deity. The city did not belong to the people. It belonged to the god. The people believed they were caretakers, maintaining the city on behalf of the divine. Religion was not separate from daily life. It was embedded in everything. The priests controlled temple lands, food storage, and redistribution. Temples functioned as economic centers. They stored grain. They employed workers. They organized trade. This leads us to one of the most important Sumerian inventions, writing. At first, there was no writing. Trade was remembered orally. But as cities grew, memory was not enough. Too many goods, too many transactions. Mistakes meant starvation. So the Sumerians began using small clay tokens to represent quantities of goods. Later, they pressed symbols into clay tablets. These symbols became writing. This system is called cuneiform. Cuneiform means wedge-shaped, because the marks were made with a reed stylus, pressed into wet clay. At first, writing was purely practical. Lists of grain, records of livestock, labor assignments. But over time, writing expanded. It recorded laws, prayers, letters, stories. This is how history itself began. Before writing, we have prehistory. With writing, we have recorded human thought. The Sumerians did not write for beauty. They wrote for control. Writing allowed administrators to manage large populations. It allowed laws to be standardized. It allowed knowledge to be passed down accurately. This brings us to law. The Sumerians created some of the earliest legal codes. These laws defined property rights, marriage rules, penalties for crimes, and economic obligations. Justice was not equal. Social class mattered. Punishments varied depending on status. But the idea that law should be written, known, and enforced was revolutionary. It replaced personal vengeance with structured authority. Sumerian society was clearly stratified. At the top were priests and rulers. Below them were skilled workers and merchants, then farmers and laborers. At the bottom were enslaved people. Slavery existed, but it was not always permanent. People could sell themselves to pay debts. Slaves could own property. They could buy their freedom. This does not make the system humane, but it shows complexity. Sumerian rulers were not kings in the later imperial sense. They were city leaders. Some were priest kings. Others were military leaders. Their power was limited by tradition, religion, and councils. Cities often competed with one another. They fought over land, water rights, and trade routes. This warfare was small-scale, but frequent. There was no unified Sumerian empire. It was a collection of city-states, each with its own identity. Despite conflict, trade connected them. The Sumerians traded extensively. They lacked stone, metal, and timber, so they exchanged grain, textiles, and crafted goods for resources from distant lands. Trade routes stretched into Anatolia, the Indus Valley, and the Persian Gulf. This made Sumer a hub of early globalization. The Sumerians also made major advances in mathematics. They used a base 60 system. This is why we have 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. They developed geometry to measure land. They calculated areas and volumes. Math was practical. It served agriculture, architecture, and trade. They also studied the sky. Astronomy began as astrology. The movement of planets was believed to reflect divine will, but careful observation led to calendars, timekeeping, and seasonal prediction. Their calendar helped farmers know when to plant and harvest. In medicine, the Sumerians combined observation with belief. They recorded symptoms. They used herbal remedies. But illness was also seen as spiritual imbalance. Doctors and priests often worked together. Some treatments worked, others did not. But the attempt to understand disease was an early step toward science. Daily life in Sumer was busy and structured. Most people lived in small mud-brick homes. Streets were narrow. Cities were crowded. People rose early. They worked long hours. Food was simple: bread, beer, dates, and vegetables. Beer was safer than water. It was thick, nutritious, and common. Children attended schools, called edubas. They learned to write cuneiform. Education was difficult. Students copied tablets endlessly. Mistakes were punished. Literacy was rare and valuable. Only a small percentage could read and write. These scribes held power. They controlled information. They preserved knowledge. Now we must ask an important question. Why did Sumer decline? The answer is not simple, but it is clear. Environmental strain played a major role. Irrigation caused salt buildup in the soil. Over centuries, crop yields declined. Cities became harder to sustain. Political instability increased. Rival cities weakened one another. Eventually, outside powers moved in. The Akkadians conquered Sumer. Later came the Babylonians and Assyrians. Sumerian culture did not vanish. It was absorbed. Their writing, laws, religious ideas, and technologies lived on. Even their myths survived. Stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, a tale of kingship, friendship, and mortality. It asks a question, still relevant today. What does it mean to be human? As we pause here, remember this. The Sumerians were not perfect. They were not peaceful. They were not enlightened. But they were first. They discovered, through trial and error, how humans could live together in large, organized societies. Almost everything that followed built upon their foundations. In the next part, we will go deeper into Sumerian religion, daily routines, myths, technology, and exactly how their legacy shaped later civilizations, moving deeper into the inner life of Sumerian civilization. Not just what they built, but how they understood the world and their place within it. To truly understand the Sumerians, we must understand their worldview. The Sumerians believed the universe was controlled by powerful gods who were unpredictable, emotional, and often indifferent to human suffering. This belief was shaped by their environment. The rivers that gave life could also destroy everything without warning. Floods came suddenly. Droughts lingered. From this uncertainty grew a belief that the gods must be constantly appeased. Religion was not about comfort. It was about survival. The Sumerian pantheon was vast. At the top stood An, the sky god, symbol of authority. Enlil, god of wind and storms, controlled fate and kingship. Enki, god of water and wisdom, was a creator and problem solver, often helping humanity survive divine disasters. Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, and war, was one of the most complex deities in the ancient world. She embodied contradiction, creation and destruction, desire and violence. These gods were not distant. They were believed to live within the city itself, inside the ziggurat. The ziggurat was not merely symbolic, it was functional. At the top was a shrine where priests performed rituals, offered food, and spoke prayers on behalf of the entire city. The gods owned the land. Humans worked it. This belief justified social order. If crops failed, the gods were displeased. If enemies attacked, the gods were angry. The solution was ritual, sacrifice, and obedience. This worldview explains much of Sumerian behavior. Why laws were strict, why rituals were constant, why priests held such authority. Yet Sumerian religion was not purely fear-based. It also sought balance, harmony between gods, humans, and nature. Rituals followed precise calendars. Festivals marked seasons. Offerings followed exact measurements. Order mattered, because chaos was always near. This emphasis on order carried into Sumerian technology. The wheel, often attributed to later cultures, was first used in Sumer, not for transportation at first, but for pottery. The potter's wheel allowed mass production of vessels. Later, the wheel was adapted for carts and wagons. This changed trade. Goods could move farther, faster. Sumerians also developed sailboats. The rivers became highways. Trade expanded dramatically. These were not accidents. They were solutions to practical problems. Sumerian architecture followed similar logic. Mud brick was the primary material. Stone was scarce. Bricks were made from river clay, dried in the sun. This made buildings vulnerable to erosion, so cities required constant rebuilding. This is why many Sumerian ruins appear as layered mounds. Each generation built atop the last. This continuous rebuilding created deep cultural continuity. Now let us turn to daily life, not of elites, but ordinary people. Most Sumerians were farmers. They worked fields outside city walls. Their days were long. Labor followed the sun. Plowing, planting, irrigating, harvesting. Tools were simple. Wooden plows, stone blades, later bronze tools. Families worked together. Men, women, and children all contributed. Women held more rights in Sumer than in many later societies. They could own property. They could engage in trade. They could appear in court. Some became priestesses, business owners, or scribes. Marriage was contractual. Dowries were recorded. Divorce was possible, though consequences varied by status. Children were valued as labor and legacy. Education was limited, but influential. The scribal schools were harsh. Students copied signs repeatedly. Errors were punished. But success meant power. A scribe could rise socially. Knowledge became a ladder. Now we must address warfare. The Sumerians did fight. Cities clashed frequently, but warfare was limited. No standing armies, no empire-building ideology. Battles were short, brutal, and local. Weapons included spears, axes, and early bronze blades. Walls protected cities. Victory meant territory or tribute, not annihilation. Still, war strained resources. As population grew, competition intensified. This brings us back to decline. Environmental damage worsened. Salt accumulation reduced crop yields. Records show a shift from wheat to barley, which tolerates salt better. This tells us something important. The Sumerians were aware of the problem. They adapted, but adaptation had limits. As food production weakened, cities relied more on trade. This made them vulnerable. At the same time, Semitic-speaking peoples from the north began to gain power. Among them was Sargon of Akkad. Sargon unified the region into the first true empire. Sumer was conquered, but not erased. The Akkadians adopted Sumerian writing, religion, and administration. Sumerian became a sacred and scholarly language, much like Latin later in Europe. Even when spoken Sumerian faded, its influence remained. Later civilizations, Babylonian, Assyrian, Persian, all inherited Sumerian foundations. Their laws, their gods, their city planning, their literature. This is why Sumer matters, not because it was perfect, but because it was foundational. When we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, we hear the earliest human questions: fear of death, desire for meaning, the pain of loss. Gilgamesh seeks immortality. He fails and learns that legacy, not eternal life, is what remains. That lesson still echoes. As we come toward the end of this journey, it becomes clear. Civilization did not appear fully formed. It emerged slowly through mistakes, experiments, and adaptation. The Sumerians did not know they were creating history. They were simply solving problems. How to grow food, how to share water, how to live together. In doing so, they changed everything. Tonight, as this story settles, remember that the modern world, its cities, its laws, its timekeeping, its writing, all trace back to that flat land between two rivers. Quietly, patiently, the Sumerians laid the first stones of civilization, and from them, the human story began. You can let the details fade now, like river water returning to its course. The story is complete.